o'clock, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I know, that's what I was thinking. We'll begin by welcoming you to the offices of the Anti-War Committee. My name is Jess Sundin. I'm a member of the Anti-War Committee, and if you're with the media, you should have gotten a press packet. If you didn't, can you raise your hand? Okay. There may be some extras for others to have at the end. This office was raided by the FBI on September 24th, 2010, at the same time as 5 homes in Minneapolis and 2 homes in Chicago. Subsequently, 23 anti-war international solidarity activists have received subpoenas to appear in front of a Chicago grand jury in this case. None of us has testified in Chicago, and the proceedings are shrouded in secrecy. None of us has even been told whether or not we are the targets of this investigation. Today, we will share with you the first confirmation we have of some of the government's intentions in this case. FBI agents who raided the home of Mick Kelly and Lyndon Gaboy took with them thousands of pages of documents and books, along with the computers, cell phones, and a passport. But by mistake, they also left something behind: the operations plans for the raid, interview questions for the activists they would meet that day, surveillance photos taken before the raid, duplicate evidence collection forms. The file of secret FBI documents was accidentally mixed in with Gaboy's files and was found in a filing cabinet on April 30th, so just a couple weeks ago. We are now releasing them to the public. Today we'll have 4 speakers address concerns raised by the contents of these documents, and after each of us has made our statements, we will open the floor for questions from the media. I would ask that our friends and supporters who are in the room, we're glad to have you here, but we'd like you to save your questions or comments for after the press conference closes. An electronic copy of these documents can be found online at stopfbi.net. And we'll have hard copies, as I said, in the press packets here today. So without going any further, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Attorney Bruce Nestor.
Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Nestor. I'm an attorney that has been advising some of the individuals who have received grand jury subpoenas and who had their homes and offices raided. I'm going to primarily talk about what these documents show about FBI guidelines and investigative practices, their ability to monitor and conduct surveillance of political groups, as well as what some of the interview questions show about the use of the grand jury as a tool to go after political organizations. The documents left by the Federal Bureau of Investigation essentially state that this investigation was initiated because 2 longtime anti-war organizers in the Twin Cities publicly traveled to Colombia, hosted speakers from Colombia, and openly spoke at public events about their travels while at the same time criticizing U.S. policy in Colombia. All of these actions were public, all of these actions were well known, and the views of these organizers were well known. Yet this is what the documents state served as a predicate for the investigation. And predicate is an FBI word, and a word that comes from the Attorney General guidelines that talks about what's necessary to begin an investigation of a group involved in protected First Amendment activity. And what the current guidelines say is that no predicate is required in order to begin a preliminary investigation, which would include sending FBI agents and law enforcement agents to public meetings and to public places in gathering publicly available information, and then storing that information about activists and their activities, their political views, essentially in perpetuity. While it is not a crime to travel to Colombia, it is not a crime to travel to Colombia or criticize the United States foreign policy. In fact, by stating that those activities were the predicate for the investigation, it's clear that this investigation is initiated without evidence of criminal activity. However, under the relaxed FBI guidelines for the investigation and surveillance of political groups, evidence of a crime is not required to begin an investigation. Despite the well-documented historical abuses by the FBI, from the surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. to the disruption of the Black Panthers, to the infiltration and surveillance of groups opposed to U.S. policy in Central America during the 1980s, the FBI now operates under guidelines from the Attorney General which allows surveillance and monitoring of political groups and organizers with little oversight or restraint. Recent FBI practices under these loosened guidelines have been widely criticized, including by the FBI's own Inspector General in January of 2010, which noted an egregious breakdown in FBI oversight of such investigations. These guidelines, adopted largely by the Bush administration, are essentially unchanged under the administration of President Obama. The lack of oversight and restraint on the FBI, coupled with the broad reach of material support laws, pose a particular threat to the ability of citizens to challenge U.S. foreign policy, to travel abroad, and to gather information about the effects of U.S. policy, and to oppose U.S. support for repressive governments abroad. Had these material support laws been in effect during the 1980s, when the Reagan administration treated Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress as a terrorist organization, the entire anti-apartheid movement, including perhaps Barack Obama, who at that time was an anti-apartheid activist, would have been subject to monitoring of their activities, infiltration of their public meetings, and the similar types of activities that we're seeing here. Examination of the questions which the FBI intended to ask during these raids, to me, demonstrates the threat that this investigation and the material support laws together pose to the right of citizens to challenge the national security establishment. These questions, as listed in the documents that you have, include questions about whether people ever met a woman named Lilia Obando. Now, Ms. Obando is a union organizer in Colombia, who Colombian military intelligence alleges is a member of the FARC, a guerrilla revolutionary organization in Colombia. She lived for years in Canada and has spoken widely in the United States. She traveled to the United States with a visa granted by the U.S. government under laws which state that people suspected of membership in terrorist organizations cannot be granted visas. Now, years after she visited the Twin Cities, people's homes are being raided, and the FBI intends to question people about their contact with Ms. Obando. These laws, the material support laws, actually specify that providing lodging is a form of material support. Not providing weapons or money or even having you don't need the intent to further any sort of violent activity, but merely providing lodging. So years after Ms. Obando comes to the Twin Cities, people can be questioned about, did they know her, did they meet with her, who else did they meet, what did they know when they met with her, because they can be accused of providing lodging for someone who a foreign intelligence service that receives billions of dollars of U.S. aid now claims is a member of an organization designated by the State Department to be a terrorist organization. That then can become a criminal predicate for a much larger investigation. And it shows the dangers in the combination of how the guidelines interact with the material support law. The reach of the material support law is so broad that people who want to travel internationally, that want to speak to people, that want to talk to union organizers are at threat of the types of raids and surveillance and activities that we're seeing in this case. I guess my final comments, I just want to talk a little bit about the grand jury subpoenas that were sent to 23 people, mostly Palestinian activists. I urge you, if you look at the type of questions that the FBI wanted to ask during these raids that are on the list of questions that they left behind, those are the type of questions that would have been asked during a grand jury investigation. Those would have been asked to you by a prosecutor when you're in a room without your lawyer. You're the only person from your side there, and you're being asked questions about who do you know, who do you associate with, what are your beliefs, what groups do you belong to. And that's precisely why so many people refuse to testify in front of a grand jury and to be subjected to that type of questioning about their political associations, their political beliefs, and their political activities.
Thank you, Bruce. Next, we're going to hear from Meredith Abbey of the Antiwar Committee.
In my speech today, I'm going to focus on the security plan that the FBI had for the raid on Mick Kelly and Lyndon Gauboy's apartment. And the documents, the one specifically labeled Operations Order for the FBI SWAT for the Operation Principal Parts, the raid in the Kelly-Gauboy home has the word dangerous and all capital letters underlined bold at the top of the page. The FBI agents were instructed to bring assault rifles, machine guns, and 2 extra clips of ammunition for each of their sidearms. 2 paramedics were to stand by in the event of casualties. The other documents include photos of Kelly and Gauboy as well as pictures of the stairs leading to their front door and the front door itself, which were obviously taken during surveillance of the apartment building before the raids. On September 24th, Linden was awoken by the FBI pounding on her door. When she asked to see the search warrant, agents used a battering ram on the door, knocking it off its hinges and shattering a fish tank in the process. She was then taken down the front steps of her apartment building in her nightgown while the FBI SWAT team entered her home. The justification for this armed home invasion and excessive show of force was given in the documents as, quote unquote, Kelly is believed to be the owner of an unknown number of firearms which may be at his residence. Well, I grew up in rural Minnesota, where I think I can safely say a significant number of people have firearms in their homes. Both the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and Minnesota state law protect this right. Gun ownership should not be considered legitimate grounds for this level of risk to both Mick and Linden's safety. The operations plan also claims that Mick Kelly was offered to provide weapons training, quote unquote, which is a ridiculous lie. I assume this lie was one of the many made up by, quote unquote, Karen Sullivan, we don't know her name, to justify her 2.5-year infiltration of the anti-war movement, particularly the Antiwar Committee. I have known Mick since 1985, and he has never offered to me, or my knowledge, anyone weapons training. The portrayal of Mick as an action movie villain is absolutely absurd. And an example of the type of fiction I can only assume that Officer Sullivan told the FBI, and I assume also told the grand jury in Chicago. My home was also raided on September 24th, and I was threatened that day by the fact that close to 10 agents and officers with guns took over my home where I was alone with my 18-month-old daughter. Reading these documents, I am now struck with horror at what they were prepared to do to Mick and Linden. And therefore, what were they prepared to do to my own family when they were coming in my home? On September 24th, not just my daughter, but 2 other children under the age of 6 in Minneapolis and Chicago saw people with guns burst into their homes and tear through their belongings. And our children are still haunted by those events. The lies of Karen Sullivan put our families at risk for absolutely no reason. It is outrageous to portray any of us as dangerous, let alone Mick. And it was absurd and dangerous to tell agents that they were going to raid the home of Mick under such false pretenses. This operation plan is literally written in a way to make the agents fear Mick and expect him to threaten them. This plan is also reckless because it required agents to bring hundreds of bullets for a raid on a small 1-bedroom apartment. The bottom line is this: we are being targeted for our ideas and our political activity. There is no legitimate justification for the raids in the first place, unless for it to be done by agents smashing in doors, wielding machine guns. This operation plan was a recipe for people getting hurt or even killed. Although no one was injured that day, we are still concerned that our civil liberties have been trampled upon, and we will continue to defend ourselves against this unjust investigation by U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald and the FBI.
Thanks, Meredith. So I want to talk about how the documents confirm what I've been saying since September 24th about this case. I am being targeted for who I know and what I believe, specifically for my work in solidarity with Columbia, work that has always been open, public, and legal. The documents say we first became targets of the investigation and prosecution as a result of our solidarity with the peoples of Columbia, specifically naming work and travels by myself and Meredith. The operations order states, the captioned case was initially predicated on the activities of Meredith Abbey and Jessica Ray Sundin in support of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, a U.S. State Department designated foreign terrorist organization, to include their travel to FARC-controlled territory. What began as an investigation of the work Meredith and I had done openly in support of the Colombian people became a giant monster involving 6 FBI division offices, raiding 7 homes in this office, trying to interrogate activists across the country, and subpoenaing 23 of us to the Chicago grand jury. As for Meredith and I, neither of us gave any kind of aid to the FARC. I did have a chance to meet with them when I traveled to Colombia 11 years ago, and I will tell you about that trip. I was there in part to witness the peace talks that were happening between the FARC and the Colombian government. There was nothing illegal about traveling to Colombia or visiting the area where the FARC is in charge. In fact, I got to that area where the peace talks were happening on an airline run by the Colombian military. I walked into a travel agency in Bogota and bought a ticket. I was there as an observer to try and learn what it would take to bring an end to this decades-long conflict, especially given that millions of US taxpayer dollars were being sent, and still are, in the form of military aid to fuel that conflict. Colombia was then, and remains today, the biggest recipient of US military aid in Latin America. The peace process was very open, and many internationals were traveling to southern Colombia for an inside look. While there, I met folks from Argentina and Europe. Reporters from the US and around the world were there, as were diplomats and many others. I was one of many visitors. When I returned, I often spoke publicly about my experiences and wrote several articles reporting on what I'd learned, both in the FARC-controlled city and at a conference in Bogota, where trade unionists, environmentalists, students, and other social movement leaders were discussing how to respond to the massive US military aid package called Plan Colombia. I believed then, and I believe now, that I was within my rights to travel to Colombia, to speak freely with whoever I met, and to share my impressions in articles and other public reports when I got back. Some of these are in your press packet. I'm not hiding what I thought about what I saw there. They're at the end. They're not secret documents like the stuff we found at Mick and Lyndon's home. The FBI is attacking anti-war activists for trying to hear about the reality of war in Colombia, about human rights abuses committed with our tax dollars, and for speaking out against US foreign policy. But this is not a crime. As Bruce mentioned, some of the interview questions asked about trade unionists who have traveled to speak with audiences here in the US about the impact of our government's military aid, both to Colombia and also to Israel. One of these is Liliana Obando, who Bruce talked about. She's a well-known Colombian trade unionist, and she spoke in the Twin Cities at an event organized by the Antiwar Committee. As was stated, she received a visa from the US government. She spoke about the sickening human rights violations that were carried out by the government of Colombia and its paramilitary allies. She also talked about the devastating environmental impact of the aerial fumigation campaign sponsored by the United States. In Colombia, I witnessed a country run by a death squad government. Our tax dollars buy the chainsaws that dismember the victims of massacres. And I'm not just exaggerating. I'm still learning Spanish, and someone was using a chainsaw to cut some wood when I was there. And I said, how do you say chainsaw in Spanish? And I have zero recollection of the answer because they proceeded to tell me about how the death squads use these chainsaws against the people that they kill. We are right to expose the US role in a country like that. And I'm thankful that Lily was able to travel here and tell more people the truth. Similarly, the interview questions inquire about Maha Nassar and the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees, which she came to the United States as a representative of. She too was granted a visa and spoke at several public events about the situation that Palestinians live under with a brutal Israeli occupation sponsored by the United States. The FBI raids and the secret grand jury aim to criminalize those of us who organize speaking events for these women or who traveled abroad to witness the situation for ourselves. The documents we're making available today are the first confirmation we have of what the government is thinking, where this investigation began, and how it expanded outward. It began when an undercover police officer, going by the name Karen Sullivan, infiltrated the Anti-War Committee shortly before the 2008 Republican National Convention. Meredith and I were among the first people that she met, and we both spoke openly and publicly at events about what we had seen in Colombia. Karen Sullivan, a professional liar, that's everything she ever told me for 2.5 years was a lie. She proceeded to give her reports to the FBI, and the investigation expanded outward, starting with Colombia, then Palestine, and paving the road to the September 24th raids. The last thing I want to say is that the interview questions aren't limited to our international solidarity work, but they also wanted to ask about groups that some of us work in here in the United States, the Anti-War Committee and Freedom Road Socialist Organization. What I find disturbing, there's a lot of things, but one of the things that I find disturbing about this line of questioning is its attempt to stir up a kind of 1950s Red Scare within the anti-war movement. It's true, some of us are socialists, but that's not against the law. A lot of people have grievances with capitalism. The government has no right to dictate to the anti-war movement who can and can't be in our movement, and what the political affiliations we're entitled to have. The fact that either the anti-war movement or the Antiwar Committee itself. None of this case is about actual material support to terrorism as any of us, any normal person would understand it. None of us has ever given any money or arms to any of the groups on the government's list. Instead, this is about criminalizing anti-war and international solidarity activism. And us practicing our rights to speak out and organize. We have done nothing wrong. On the contrary, our activism makes this world a better place. Most people in this country are opposed to U.S. wars abroad. The anti-war movement and the Antiwar Committee will continue to welcome all those who will stand with us against these wars. Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from McKelly, of notoriety in these documents, but also a member of the Committee to Stop FBI Repression.
Good afternoon. I'm glad so many of you could make it. Just by way of an introduction, I am Mick Kelly. I'm a longtime activist in the anti-war movement, other social movements. I'm also a member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and I've been active working for social change since the war in Vietnam. And I think many of you know, because quite a few of you have interviewed me in the past, I was also one of the organizers for the massive demonstration that took place on the first day of the Republican National Convention. And I was also one of the people who was raided on September 24th and called before the grand jury. What I'd like to do is make a few comments about the political tenor of some of the documents that you've seen. And what I'd like to focus on in particular is the line of questions that you have in your packets. I think there's a couple of points that are salient. Number one, there is a complete disregard for the rights of anti-war and international solidarity activists to express our views, our freedom of speech, and our right to association. The documents make it clear, they make it absolutely clear, that legal activity in solidarity with the people of Colombia and Palestine is what's being targeted. And in addition, and this is something I find extremely disturbing, there is an odd 1950s Red Scare kind of tone to it, which you will also find if you go back and look at the search warrants. We see this coming through again and again. Basically, if you read it, it reads like something right out of the 1950s. I think most people here have some familiarity with history and are well aware that for a long time in our neighboring state of Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy ran amok, basically trying to deny people their rights, deny communists their rights, deny socialists their rights, deny anybody who would speak up against the government their rights. And what we see in these documents is basically that the FBI is taking a cue from this extremely shameful past. Specifically, the document contains 57 questions directed to members of Freedom Road Socialist Organization or about Freedom Road Socialist Organization. It's actually unbelievable. The questions go like, are you a member? How many members are there? Who are the leaders? And on and on and on and on. It's as if the calendar, quite literally, has been turned back to 1952 or 1953. And I think that's something that people should find troubling. You know, our organization, by our organization in this case, I mean Freedom Road, we've never made any secrets of our views. We publish a newspaper. I actually edit that newspaper, so you can read our views there. We have websites, etc., public forums, events and programs. And we're very interested in telling people what we think. We do think, quite truthfully, capitalism is a failed system. It should go. We think socialism is superior. Growing number of Americans, according to polls, agree with us on that point, and I'm glad for that. And it's not secret and it's not hidden. And the stuff that's going on with this 1950s tone, this false stuff about material support, it's really just a way to pillory people who have done nothing wrong and everything right. And I think I'll cut it off there and take questions later.
So now the floor is open if there's any questions from the media. Yes.
I have a personal question, Mick, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way. Since you were seen as being so dangerous, I'd like to know, like, how tall, what's your height and weight?
It's in the documents.
It is in the packet, but I'm about 150 pounds and I'm about 5'10".
I think that reported to take you out, my friend.
All right.
Other questions?
I have, I guess, so I don't want to, for Bruce, you and I talked about this before. This certainly seems to, this justification seems to kind of throw the doors wide open that pretty much anybody could sort of be accused of providing material support to a terrorist organization if you traveled anywhere where they exist, if you've talked to anybody, that kind of thing. I mean, what kinds of dangers, I guess, do you see in what's come from all of this, and how much further do you see this going?
I certainly think, and that's why I speak about the interaction between these material support laws and the FBI guidelines that talk about the ability to investigate and to pursue investigations of political groups. Because the material support law has been stretched so broadly that anybody who travels, anybody who speaks with people opposed to U.S. foreign policy in other countries is at risk of being investigated, if not prosecuted. And again, that's where they talk about the predicate for the investigation. The initial predicate for the investigation, all they need is the fact that these two individuals have traveled to FARC-controlled areas of Colombia. And even, of course, that's, you know, a misrepresentation in a way, in that they traveled there along with dozens of journalists and diplomats and other people as part of a peace process at the time. I mean, it makes it sound like they snuck across some invisible line into a, you know, guerrilla-controlled area. But nonetheless, that's the predicate. That allows the initial investigation. And then you start to talk about, well, what evidence of a crime do you need to go beyond that? And that's where I talked about this focus on a trade union activist from Colombia, and that she was on a speaking tour here. Well, you know, if foreign intelligence wants to then claim that she's a member of FARC, well, then you can do a full-blown investigation, which includes putting in undercover police officers, such as we believe Karen Sullivan to be, to electronic surveillance or whatever other steps they may have taken in this case.
To a search? I mean, you know, is that... It's one thing to say to monitor the public activities of people, and I'm not saying that's right, but it's one thing to go from that to actually search an entry in the early morning.
I have not seen the affidavits. The government has kept those under seal, which is the justification that they gave to the court to grant the search warrant.
I guess that's my question. Where's the case at? Excuse me. Are there charges or?
Nobody's been charged. We have really had no communication or no information from the U.S. Attorney in Chicago since the last round of grand jury subpoenas in January of 2011.
So people went down to Chicago for the subpoena?
Nobody responded to the subpoenas. Everyone obtained legal counsel and indicated that they would not be answering questions in front of the grand jury, and the U.S. Attorney did not call them back.
And the questions were given to you then, these questions?
These questions were not given to us.
You found them?
Those are the questions that were left by an FBI agent. Those are the questions they were intending to ask if anyone would agree to answer questions when the raids were carried out in September. And to me, they parallel the questions that we expected would be asked if anybody went to a grand jury. But I am convinced that when we do see the affidavits for the search warrants, they will refer to people hosting speakers, probably to hosting speakers like Lilia Obando, or hosting a speaker like Maha Nasser from the Union of Palestinian Women. And they will try to put that in an evil light, that you knew that person was a member of a terrorist organization, or that even if you knew they were, that you by there meant to support them or to somehow fund them. As opposed to provide their lodging and allow someone who opposes U.S. foreign policy to share their views. What that means, again, if these laws had been in effect, Nelson Mandela could not have been released from Robben Island and traveled to the United States in the 1980s to speak out against apartheid. Anybody hosting him could have been subject to prosecution. Anybody lodging him could have been guilty of providing material support. That's, I mean, to really is what the danger when I view that we have two political parties that are largely united on issues of foreign policy, that have close ties with a very strong military and a very strong military-industrial complex. I think even a moderate Republican like Dwight Eisenhower might agree with me on that. You know, what is the ability of citizens to gather information on their own and to come to their own views about U.S. foreign policy, regardless of where they end up, regardless of whether they decide they're for or against some policy or for or against? Are we supposed to accept on blind faith that the U.S. aid to Colombia, to a government that's allied with right-wing paramilitaries and kills the highest killing of trade union activists in the Western Hemisphere, that's all about furthering democracy? Or can we gather information on our own? And that's really what I think is threatened here in a very clear way.
I have a question here.
Yeah, I guess I'm confused about how these documents were not found till April 30th. And how were they found? Why did it take so long to find them?
If you want to address that?
Certainly, I'd be glad to address it. It could have conceivably taken much longer to find it. But the background on it is this. On September 24th, when the FBI raided the house of myself and my wife, Lyndon Cowboy, they emptied the file cabinets, desks, etc. And there was quite literally thousands of files stacked around our apartment. And they set up desks and places where they were going through each individual document, reading each individual paper, carting boxes up, and taking them away. Later, on April 30th, Lyndon was looking through a file cabinet, and lo and behold, she said, "I think the FBI left something behind." And it turned out to be the operational plans and the documents that we're talking about. There's no doubt that they were mixed in at the time when they had files everywhere. And it's, whatever. You can judge how easy or not easy it would be to make a mistake like that, but I'm certainly disappointed they made that mistake.
Have there been any response from the FBI to this? Do they?
We haven't spoken with them.
And
You're welcome to give them a call.
have they contacted you, like the Attorney General, about this not showing up for the subpoenas or any? I guess I'm just
No, the only
kind of confused where the case is at right now.
yeah, the subpoenas are still outstanding, meaning once you're served with a subpoena, at least there may be a point at which they're not, we don't even know that the grand jury is still in session necessarily. But assuming the grand jury is still in session, the subpoenas are still outstanding and can be enforced at any time. The U.S. Attorney has chosen not to take any further steps to enforce the subpoenas once people initially indicated they would not voluntarily show up and answer questions.
When's the last time they had contact with you?
I believe January, well, on that issue in January 25th.
Follow, just a clarification, none of your stuff has been returned yet, has it, that they took in the search? Or has it?
Yeah. Basically what's happened there is the FBI took 9, 10, 11 boxes of books, papers, cell phones, etc. I have received back, for example, my cell phone, the documents, papers, etc. the FBI still has. And disturbing to me too, they still have my passport, taking away my right.
So they still have the boxes of documents that
Yes.
they took?
Yes,
they
they
returned
do.
your cell phone?
My cell phone, yes. And they have, and they still have my passport.
Does this packet represent the totality of the FBI documents that you found in your apartment?
There's two things that aren't in there. One is some blank forms, which are in the electronic version that's online if you want to look at those. There were also some pages that were stamped for law enforcement use only, I believe, and our attorneys advised us not to release those.
Can you characterize those at all, or no?
They're basically lists of FBI names and cell phone numbers and who was in charge of what part of the raid.
Meredith, when they searched you, you said your 18-month-old daughter was home with you at the time that they burst into your place too?
Yeah, she was asleep upstairs, and the FBI. I can't tell if they had surrounded my house or what they're doing. I only interacted with the agents that were on the front porch, and they stormed in and they, were very loud and said they were looking for evidence of material support for terrorism and would I help them. My answer was no. And then they asked if there was anyone else in the house because they wanted to secure the house. And I explained that my 18-month-old was upstairs asleep in her crib. And they said, okay, and they searched the house and determined that actually that was true. The only other person in the house was her. And we negotiated that Audrey would get to sleep, continue to sleep, because they basically held me in my living room. I wasn't allowed to leave. And their plan was they wanted me to stay in one room while they searched my house. And I explained to them, my daughter had learned to walk, at 10.5 months. Once you learn to walk, you don't really slow down after that. I said, I don't think it's going to work out so well for her to just stay in one room. She's not going to understand that. And so they agreed that she could continue to sleep, and I called and contacted my partner, who was able to come home within 20 minutes of when Audrey woke up. And so, but I did have to get a police escort to go get my daughter out of her crib. I had police surveillance in order to do things like change her diaper and put on her clothes and make her breakfast. And every room, I had asked permission to go from room to room in my own home, and had to be, and I was under surveillance by a Minneapolis police officer who was armed.
For these interview questions, so did they request to interview you when they came to raid?
So all three of us had, I think, similar experiences, and I think everyone had the same experience, that our first reaction when they arrived was to tell them that we wouldn't cooperate. And in my case, they didn't proceed to try to interview me. I haven't heard that anyone else, they pressed further with asking questions. I think that once we said decline to chat with them, they just proceeded with their search.
I have a question about the questions that are listed for McKelly. Do you own a gun? For what? Have you taught any FRISO members how to shoot? Do you own a gun, and did they take a gun from your apartment? And is there such a thing as are people being taught to shoot by FRISO?
Sure, glad to answer the question. I figured someone would. I learned how to shoot when I was in Boy Scouts at Camp Castle Rock, and yes, I own 2 guns. I own a rifle and I own a handgun, and I've gone shooting actually most of my adult life, and I still, when I'm up at the cabin, I still do it. In terms of weapons training or something like that, it's a fantasy, and it's ridiculous, and it's wrong. And the most likely place that it originates from is the police officer, Karen Sullivan. She approached me, actually, I think it was at someone's birthday party, and was asking me about shooting. And what I said to her at the time was, well, we could go out to Bill's Guns, which is a range out in Robbinsdale, and we can rent a gun and we can shoot together, and it would be fun. And that was my comment to her on the matter. So nothing I think too lively there. So.
Is there any discussion of litigation taken up by you guys for a countersuit or anything like that?
Not at this point. I mean, all those options are open down the road, but at this point there's an ongoing criminal investigation of up to 16 or 23 people involving 10 FBI offices, and we're waiting to see what the full power of the U.S. government brings down upon these people's heads.
What's the timeline? Any idea?
Entirely unknown. That'd be a good question to ask the U.S. Attorney.
Let us know if you find out.
Yeah. Nick looked like he had.
Are there any other questions? So, absent any further questions, I'm just going to close. Before we close today, I want to report a new and outrageous attack on one of our fellow activists in relation to this case that I became aware of after I arrived at the office this afternoon. Yesterday, the Los Angeles home of Carlos Montes was raided. His political papers were seized along with his cell phone and computer. Carlos was named on the September 24th search warrant for this office. They had a list of names, and they said they wanted anything from the Antiwar Committee offices about Carlos. And yesterday the FBI was on the scene at the raid of his home and attempted to question him about this case, though he refused. After he has a chance to consult with his own attorneys on the West Coast, we'll be able to release a statement and more information about what happened in Los Angeles. But yesterday's events there make it clear that the government is still pursuing us, pursuing anti-war and international solidarity activists. We will continue to stand together to support Carlos and all those targeted in this case. I want to thank everybody for being here, and especially Indie Media and the Uptake for helping us make this available on the web live to people who couldn't be here. And for anyone who missed the announcement at the beginning, an electronic copy of the documents can be found online at stopfbi.net. If you find you have questions later, feel free to call our speakers. Their numbers are in your press packets, and you can ask us later.
So what was Carlos's last name again?
Montes. M-O-N-T-E-S. Montes.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, you're free to go.
And you're free to go.
Oh, good.
For now.
I feel bad. Yeah, we should actually make an attempt to stay more in touch with stuff out there.